In June 2022, a retired schoolteacher in Ohio logged into her Celsius account and found she could not withdraw a single dollar. She had moved her life savings there 18 months earlier because the founder had told her, repeatedly and publicly, that her money was safer there than in a bank. She was one of approximately 1.7 million customers worldwide who discovered, on the same morning, that the company had frozen all withdrawals. No warning, no timeline for when the freeze would lift. Just a message: withdrawals are paused. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that in the weeks before the freeze, Celsius executives, including its founder, Alex Mashinsky, had been quietly selling their own CEL tokens while publicly urging customers to buy and hold. She was still adding to her position on the day the doors closed. Approximately $4.7 billion in customer funds were locked inside a company that was already insolvent. Some of those customers would wait years to see a fraction of it returned. Many are still waiting. This is the story of how Alex Mashinsky convinced 1.7 million people their money was safe, and what he was doing while they believed him. Alex Mashinsky, a man who had spent years telling customers something very specific: your money is safer here than in a bank. He had said it on live streams. He had said it in interviews. He had built an entire company and an entire identity around that promise. Celsius wasn't just a platform. It was, in his words, a movement. A way to unbank yourself from a financial system he described as broken, extractive, and rigged against ordinary people. Millions of people believed him, not because they were careless, because the pitch made sense. Banks pay you almost nothing on your savings. Celsius offered customers up to 18%. Mashinsky framed the difference as proof that he had simply removed the middlemen, the banks, the bonuses, the bloated overhead, and was passing the savings back to the people who deserved it. For a while, the numbers backed him up. Celsius grew to manage billions of dollars in assets. At its peak, more than 20 billion. Investors and customers across the world trusted Mashinsky, not just as a founder, but as a kind of populist crusader, fighting on behalf of people the traditional financial system had left behind. Now the withdrawals are frozen, and a question is spreading as fast as the panic. If this was never really about beating the banks, what was it actually about? There is a tendency, after a collapse like this, to assume the warning signs must have been obvious, that everyone should have known, that the people who trusted Celsius were simply ignoring reality. But if you stop the story here, on the day withdrawals were frozen, that explanation doesn't really fit. Because Alex Mashinsky wasn't an anonymous founder operating out of a garage. He wasn't a teenager who suddenly became rich during a crypto bull market. And he wasn't someone whose entire career existed only inside cryptocurrency. For decades, Mashinsky had built real companies. Companies with employees, customers, patents, investors, and in some cases, successful exits. Long before Celsius existed, he had already established himself as a respected entrepreneur in telecommunications and infrastructure. He spoke confidently about technology because he understood technology. He spoke confidently about networks because he had spent much of his life building them. And that distinction matters. Because when people deposited their savings into Celsius, many of them weren't trusting a new crypto startup. They believed they were trusting a founder with a proven track record of solving difficult problems and challenging outdated systems. That credibility wasn't imagined. It was real. Which makes the next question far more uncomfortable. If Alex Mashinsky had already spent decades building successful companies, how did the man who promised to fix banking end up presiding over one of the largest collapses in cryptocurrency history? To understand Celsius, you have to understand that Alex Mashinsky was not a crypto outsider who stumbled into finance. By the time Celsius launched, he was already a serial entrepreneur with decades of experience building exactly this kind of company. Born in Ukraine, raised in Israel, Mashinsky moved to the United States as an adult, with a background in electrical engineering and a fascination with networks, systems where many small connections add up to something valuable. In the 1990s, he founded VoiceSmart, one of the earliest companies experimenting with voice calls over the internet. Then came Arbinet, a marketplace that let telecom companies trade phone call minutes the way traders trade stocks. Arbinet went public in 2004. It was, by most accounts, a genuine technical innovation, built years before most people understood what an exchange for bandwidth even meant. After Arbinet, more companies followed. GroundLink, an early platform for booking car services. Transit Wireless, which brought Wi-Fi into New York City's subway system. Mashinsky filed patents. He gave interviews. He cultivated a reputation as a builder, someone who identified inefficiencies in old systems and replaced them with faster, cheaper, and more connected solutions. That pattern matters because it tells us something about how Mashinsky would eventually pitch Celsius. He wasn't a first-time founder hoping to get lucky. He was a practiced storyteller who had spent 30 years convincing people that the old way of doing things was the problem and that he had already built the solution. In 2017, he turned that same instinct toward an entirely new target: banking. Here is the pitch Alex Mashinsky gave, in some version, thousands of times. Banks take your deposits. They lend that money out at high interest rates. They keep almost all of the profit for themselves and pay you, the depositor, next to nothing in return. Celsius, he said, would do it differently. Customers could deposit their cryptocurrency. Celsius would lend it out, generate yield, and pass the overwhelming majority of that yield directly back to the people who deposited it. No hidden fees, no corporate bloat, just a fairer split. It is worth pausing on how good that pitch actually was. It wasn't built on hype about price speculation. It was built on a populist grievance almost everyone has felt at some point. The sense that banks profit enormously from your money while giving you almost nothing back. Mashinsky leaned into that grievance constantly. He sold merchandise with the slogan, "Unbank yourself." He hosted weekly live streams, Ask Me Anything sessions, where he answered customer questions directly, often for hours, building a sense of intimacy and trust that traditional financial institutions never bothered to offer. And the yields were extraordinary. Up to 18% annually on certain crypto deposits, at a time when a typical savings account paid a small fraction of 1%. To some observers, those numbers raised an obvious question. If this was sustainable, safe, and simple, why didn't actual banks do the same thing? But during a multi-year bull market, with crypto prices climbing and new customers arriving daily, that question rarely got asked out loud. The returns were arriving on schedule. The platform was growing. And growth, as it so often does, looked like proof. What almost no one outside the company could see was how those returns were actually being generated, and what kind of risk was required to produce them. Every yield has a source. That is one of the oldest rules in finance, and it is also one of the easiest rules to ignore when the yield is showing up reliably in your account every week. Celsius marketed itself as a simple lending platform, connecting people who wanted to earn interest on their crypto with people who wanted to borrow it. That description was technically true. It also left out most of the picture. Behind the scenes, prosecutors would later allege, Celsius wasn't just facilitating safe, conservative loans. The company was deploying customer deposits into far riskier territory. Proprietary trading, volatile decentralized finance protocols, and bets on the broader direction of crypto markets, often without clearly disclosing those risks to customers whose money was at stake. The company had marketed itself as a safe, yield-generating alternative to a bank. According to allegations later detailed by prosecutors, the underlying risk of those bets was never properly disclosed to the customers who funded them. There is a particular kind of danger in this setup, and it isn't limited to crypto. When a platform pays a fixed, attractive return, regardless of how its underlying investments actually perform, someone has to absorb the difference when those investments go wrong. In a transparent system, that risk sits with the people who chose to take it. In an opaque one, it quietly transfers to whoever trusted the platform the most, usually the depositors, who believed they were doing something closer to a savings account than a high-risk wager. For years, the gap between the marketed simplicity and the real complexity stayed hidden, mostly because the bull market kept paying the bills. Then came a separate piece of the company's strategy, one that didn't just involve managing customer money carefully. It involved managing the price of a coin that Celsius had created itself. In 2018, Celsius launched its own cryptocurrency, CEL. The company raised roughly $50 million by selling it to investors around the world, and CEL quickly became woven into nearly every part of the platform's pitch. Customers who held CEL received better rates, lower fees, and additional rewards. A rising CEL price didn't just benefit the company, it directly benefited Mashinsky personally, who held a substantial portion of the token's supply. Federal prosecutors later alleged something specific and damaging: that Mashinsky and Celsius engaged in a scheme to manipulate the price of CEL, creating artificial trading activity designed to push the token's value upward, all while presenting that price strength to the public as organic market demand. At the same time, prosecutors said, Mashinsky was personally selling off his own CEL holdings, cashing out millions of dollars in value generated, in part, by the very price action his company was allegedly engineering. To customers watching from the outside, the message was simple. CEL is strong. The platform is strong. The founder believes in his own product so much that he holds it himself. What they could not see was the second half of that story unfolding in parallel. A founder allegedly inflated the price of an asset with one hand, while quietly reducing his own exposure to it with the other. This is the part of the story investigators would spend years untangling. Not whether Celsius had problems. By 2022, that much was becoming obvious to everyone. The harder question was how long the gap between the public story and the private one had actually existed, and how many of the company's earlier successes had depended on it. December 2024. A federal courtroom in Manhattan. Alex Mashinsky stands before Judge John Kirtle more than a year after his arrest and says something the legal system took a long time to extract from him. I know what I did was wrong. He is pleading guilty. not to all 7 of the original charges filed against him in 2023, commodities fraud, securities fraud, conspiracy, market manipulation among them, but to 2, commodities fraud and a scheme to manipulate the price of CEL. In court, Mashinsky admits to a specific thing. In a 2021 interview, he had told the public that Celsius's Earn program, the product that allowed customers to deposit crypto and receive weekly interest, had received regulatory approval. It had not. He uses a phrase describing his own conduct that prosecutors would return to repeatedly. He had given customers false comfort. That phrase does a lot of work. It is not simply the language of a man who made an honest mistake about complicated regulations. It describes a deliberate choice, telling people something reassuring, knowing it wasn't true, because the reassurance was useful. He also admits to failing to disclose that he had been selling his own CEL holdings, even as the company continued promoting the token to ordinary customers as a sound, long-term investment. For years, the public version of Celsius had been built on specific, repeatable claims: regulatory approval, aligned incentives, a founder who believed in his own product enough to hold it personally. One by one, in a single courtroom appearance, those claims collapse under the weight of Mashinsky's own admission. The question that remains isn't whether Celsius failed. By now, that's settled. The deeper question is what kind of failure this actually was, and whether anyone around Mashinsky could have stopped it before billions of dollars disappeared. By the time Celsius froze withdrawals in June 2022, the company had spent years cultivating an image of radical transparency. Weekly live streams, direct answers to customer questions, a founder who positioned himself as more accountable to his users than any bank executive would ever be. What investigators later uncovered painted a very different picture of who actually had access to information and who had time to act on it. In the lead-up to the collapse, some executives and insiders were able to withdraw their own holdings, even as the company continued publicly reassuring ordinary customers that their funds remained safe. The freeze that trapped customer assets did not apply equally to everyone who understood what was actually happening inside the company. This is one of the most consistent patterns across nearly every major financial collapse, crypto or otherwise. The information asymmetry between executives and customers isn't usually an accident. It's a structural feature of exactly this kind of opaque lending model, where insiders have real-time visibility into the platform's true financial condition. At the same time, customers have only the curated version presented in marketing materials and live streams. For the people who trusted Mashinsky's message of populist financial liberation, this detail lands with particular force. The entire pitch of Celsius was that it treated customers better than a traditional bank would. In the moment that actually mattered most, the moment the company's true condition became undeniable, many ordinary customers were given exactly what Mashinsky had built his brand against: less information, less access, less time to react. Celsius did not fail in isolation. To understand its timing, you need to understand what was happening across crypto markets in the spring of 2022. A separate, massive collapse. The implosion of a so-called stablecoin called Terra USD had just wiped out tens of billions of dollars in value across the industry in a matter of days. The shockwaves from that failure exposed weaknesses at multiple major crypto lenders simultaneously, including Celsius. Celsius had exposure to some of the very products and protocols thrown into chaos by that collapse. As asset prices fell and nervous customers began requesting withdrawals, the platform faced a problem common to nearly every lending institution under stress. It had taken in deposits that customers believed were available on demand, then deployed that same money into longer-term, harder-to-unwind positions. When enough people ask for their money back at the same time, the difference between those two timelines becomes impossible to paper over. On June 12, 2022, Celsius paused all withdrawals, swaps, and transfers between accounts. The company framed it as a necessary step to stabilize liquidity. For customers, it was the moment their assets effectively became frozen, with no clear timeline for when or whether they would get them back. 1 month later, in July 2022, Celsius filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Court filings would later reveal a hole in the company's balance sheet, measured in billions of dollars. A gap between what it owed customers and what it actually had on hand to pay them. Approximately $4.7 billion in customer funds were affected. July 2023. Alex Mashinsky is arrested and indicted on 7 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and market manipulation. He pleads not guilty that same day. What follows is more than a year of legal proceedings, document discovery, and mounting public pressure, running in parallel with a separate set of regulatory actions. The Federal Trade Commission pursued its own case, eventually securing one of the largest settlements in the agency's history. A $4.7 billion judgment tied directly to the bankruptcy, alongside a permanent ban preventing Mashinsky from ever working in the crypto or financial services industries again. Then, in December 2024, the criminal case resolves. Mashinsky pleads guilty to 2 of the 7 original charges. In open court, he admits to giving customers false assurances about regulatory approval he never had, and to failing to disclose his own token sales while publicly promoting CEL to people who trusted him. 5 months later, in May 2025, he returns to the same Manhattan courtroom for sentencing. Prosecutors describe what happened at Celsius as one of the largest frauds in the history of the cryptocurrency industry. Judge Kotel notes something more specific and more human, that victims did not simply lose money. Many lost their life savings. Many described real psychological harm in the aftermath. Mashinsky's attorneys ask for leniency, a sentence of 1 year and 1 day. The court does not agree. 12 years in federal prison, 3 years of supervised release, a fine of $50,000, forfeiture of more than $48 million in personal assets. It is one of the longest sentences ever handed down in a crypto fraud case, longer even than many predicted, for a founder whose company never reached the scale or notoriety of FTX, but whose core promise to ordinary people may have been even more direct. Your money is safer here than in a bank. Bankruptcy proceedings move slowly, and Celsius was no exception. After emerging from Chapter 11 in 2024, the company began distributing assets to creditors, eventually returning approximately $3 billion to customers whose funds had been frozen since that first message in June 2022. For some, that recovery represents real relief, even years later than anyone would have liked. For others, particularly those who held tokens or assets that lost the majority of their value during the collapse, the recovery covers only a fraction of what they originally believed they had. The FTC's $4.7 billion judgment against Mashinsky personally remains, in practical terms, largely symbolic. Collecting that amount from an individual, even one who built an empire on customer deposits, is a very different exercise than collecting it from a company with assets still being sorted through bankruptcy court. And the case itself isn't entirely closed, even now. In May 2026, more than a year into his 12-year sentence, Mashinsky filed a handwritten motion from prison asking a federal court to vacate his sentence entirely, citing ineffective legal counsel and what he describes as tainted evidence. It is, in its own way, a familiar contradiction to end on. A man who built his entire public identity around radical transparency and direct communication with his customers is now arguing, from inside a federal facility, that the system convicted him unfairly. Whether that motion succeeds is still unknown. What is already settled is the guilty plea itself, the moment, in his own words, that he admitted exactly what he had done. There is a version of this story that makes Alex Mashinsky sound unique. A uniquely persuasive salesman, a uniquely reckless founder, a singular bad actor in an industry full of them. That version is comforting, but it's almost certainly not the most useful way to understand what happened. Because the core mechanism behind Celsius wasn't really about cryptocurrency at all. It was about a much older pattern, a promise of returns that sound too good to require real risk, delivered by someone who positions himself as fighting on your behalf against a system you already distrust. Banks, Wall Street, the old guard. Mashinsky didn't invent that grievance. He simply gave it a slogan, a live stream, and an interest rate. And for a while, the math worked. The deposits kept arriving, and the story held together. Right up until the moment it didn't. The question this case leaves behind isn't really about whether Alex Mashinsky was telling the truth. The guilty plea already answered that. It's about how many people heard a promise that sounded almost exactly like this one, are hearing it again right now, somewhere else, and have no way yet of knowing whether they're early investors in the next innovation, or customers number 1 million in someone else's version of the same story.